welcome to the show. My guest today is Rennie. Robin, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Good morning. Yes, I originated in Scotland, born and bred in Glasgow, then moved down to Shropshire. I lived in Shrewsbury, and then moved to, where did we go then? I was working I was at college in Birmingham for 3 years, teacher training college. Then got a job in, where was the first job? In Surrey, children's residential home. Then back up to the Midlands, worked in again another residential home near Birmingham.
And you worked a lot in social care.
Absolutely,
over
yes.
your life, yeah.
Yes, I did a couple of years as a teacher in Solihull, next to Birmingham, and then got into the mixed area of social care and teaching school, and then into social care in Essex.
Cool. And you had a spell in the Home Office, if I'm correct.
When I was at Essex County Council in charge of adult care services across the county, one of my responsibilities then was refugees and asylum seekers.
Right.
It wasn't a big issue to start with, and then it became a bigger issue.
Yeah.
And I was asked to represent the East of England on a committee in the Home Office, which I did. And then they asked me whether I could be seconded from my post at the County Council to establish a consortium for asylum seekers and refugees across the East of England. It was one of the few parts of the country that hadn't yet had their consortium built. So, yes, eventually my bosses at the County Hall agreed with the Home Office that they could second me for a year to set that up, which is what I did. Then there was while that was going on, there was a restructuring in my original job area in social services. So they invited me back to say, do you want this job, which was a bit similar to the one I had before, or do you want to go take early retirement with some sort of deal on your pension? So
yeah.
I looked at all the figures, I looked at the implications and decided, yes, I would take early retirement, and then I would be working not directly with the Home Office, but sat on two of their committees, and also headed up the East of England for a while. But then also I was asked to be an advisor to the EU committee.
All right, we're getting topical now.
at Brussels, so I had to attend there a few times as well, and it all got very busy. And then the consortium in Scotland, the two people that ran that and had run it from the beginning, left very sharply, and I was asked to go and run that for 2 days a week. So they did it full time.
So that was going
for two of them, and I was asked to do it part time.
And that was going to Scotland.
That was the whole of
2 days a week.
Yes, the whole of Scotland. Sometimes I didn't go for 2 days. Sometimes I had to go for 4 or 5 days.
Did you manage that well, going between Essex and Scotland? So?
Yes, it's okay. Stansted to Glasgow, and a good train service from Glasgow airport to the city. And I quite liked going back to my homeland and see some parts of the country that reminded me of my younger days.
Oh, good. So when you were working at the Home Office, what was your official job title?
Well, it was, I headed up a subcommittee for the health agenda. So I had to link in with the Department of Health and obviously I had a committee made up of different parts of the country. All the consortiums had a representative for them, for health. So I chaired that for a while. But also I was attached to a couple of the ministers with responsibility for refugees and asylum seekers, and that was quite an interesting time because it was a new agenda for some of them as well. And whilst the rules and regulations appeared to be quite simple, it set up a lot of emotional incidents that they found it difficult to come to terms with, and with their constituents and their fellow MPs, etc.
Can you elaborate a bit on some of those?
Yeah, some of them were the way that the Home Office made decisions about people coming to this country,
right,
staying in this country, and one of the things I was asked to do was consider setting up a new system for bringing in refugees from certain places. And one of the important ones at the time was from Iraq.
Of course, yeah.
Because a number of the Iraqis had worked with the British forces out there, mainly as interpreters.
Just to clarify, this was during the height of the Iraq War, was it?
It was, yes, it was sort of during the end of that, and,
right,
and
okay.
The implications afterwards.
Right, of course, with the leaving no government in place,
yeah.
And a lot of people displaced at the end of that.
Yes, and the people that had been working alongside British forces, a lot of them were threatened, and their families were threatened with death if they stayed there. So they had to get out fairly quickly. And so I, with a friend of mine from the church organisations, set up a new, not company, but a organisation that brought in six Iraqi families to Colchester, and we used local churches to look at where they were going to live. The town council were involved as well to provide housing, and other organisations, clearly social services and housing and all the rest of it. And that was very successful. Certainly the way the churches worked together and the way that families were brought in and settled very quickly into children went to schools and all the rest of it. So it was quite a busy time, and it hadn't been done before like that. So that was quite a good model that other parts of the country then took on.
So which hurdles did you personally face, and how did you overcome them during this period? I'm assuming this wasn't, no picnic.
No, and some of the refugees and asylum seekers had been placed in different. This wasn't the project I was talking about. This was before and during. So they would come in. Some of them would then go to a holding centre near Cambridge. There was one, and I had to go there a few times to talk to people who were not quite locked up, but certainly they weren't allowed to leave the centre until the Home Office had made decisions on their future.
Right.
So some of that was very emotional, and at that time I was also invited to join the trustees of a organisation that was specialising in providing law assistance to legal assistance to refugees who are making their case to stay, and that was the Immigration Advisory Service, which was quite interesting as well.
Now, I definitely want to get back to the Home Office at some point, and there's more there I want to ask you about. staying on this particular issue, bringing it to now, with this is still an issue, not so much with Iraq anymore, but with other places. In regards to the situation that we're seeing at the moment, with refugees and asylum seekers.
Yes.
Now, there's been a number of criticisms by the Home Office, of the Home Office during some of these. One of which is that let's say the right people haven't been prioritised in coming over. I remember the whole scandal with that there were adult men claiming to be children, coming over, claiming to be from Syria or these sort of places. Another criticism is that some of these places in which refugees are currently coming from, in very big numbers. Yes, there are places like Syria and Iraq where there's obviously conflict ongoing, but then there are other, people coming from other places as well. Sometimes within Europe, or sometimes within Africa, these sort of places, and they're described as economic migrants. Who are essentially just coming here for a better way of life. Do you what do you sort of make of this situation? Because a lot of people are saying that it's sometimes it's impossible to.
Yes, and in amongst all the genuine refugees traffic into this country and other countries, obviously, there were groups who were making money out of bringing people in for different reasons, and using the asylum seeker bit and the refugee legislation and assistance to get through. And one of those areas that had to look at for a while was the Calais.
Of course, yeah.
The big
Calais crossing
camp at Calais.
The Calais jungle, I believe they referred to
part
it
of
as,
it.
yeah.
And the trend of gathering round the where the lorries either parked or were queuing to get across into across the channel, and so that was quite a big issue. And in my work at the Brussels thing, I did have a meeting once with the mayor of Calais, and looked at some of the issues that they were facing, which were really serious for them as well.
Yeah.
Because they had, all these people coming across France from different places. Because obviously with France and Spain next to the Mediterranean, people were coming across in boats and little boats and that sort of thing into Spain, up to France, and heading towards the Calais end of France, and then they would just sit there and wait for an opportunity to get over the channel into this country.
Well, that's essentially, we're also getting, there's reports now coming out of the Mediterranean that, traffickers, smugglers, that kind of thing, people who get refugees out, don't even need to go all the way now. All they need to do is sort of go, across the Mediterranean, just to the point where, let's say, Italian boats or something like that are going to come and rescue them. But yeah, that's one of the big, one of the big issues about this whole thing is the fact it's not so much, where they're coming from and that kind of thing. It's the numbers. We're looking at sheer unprecedented numbers at the moment, and it doesn't seem to a lot of people, especially you take somewhere like Italy, where everything was one island in Italy was the main source of people coming across the Mediterranean. And we're talking very unsustainable numbers. So there has been this call as well for, and I'm wondering what your sort of opinion is on this. There has been a lot of call from people of repatriation. So there is an argument to say, if we're taking people from, let's say, Syria, places where there is ongoing ongoing warfare or conflict and that kind of thing, or like we've seen in Syria, there are areas occupied by Islamists, jihadists, and that kind of thing. But there is this argument that once these conflicts have been resolved, or the best way that they can. So you see places like Syria, we're now seeing Assad getting more of a hold on the territory over there. The jihadists are kind of dying out. So there is this argument, okay, well, once these sort of conflicts are done, then naturally refugees over here should be repatriated back. What would you say to that?
Well, it's interesting. If you go back in time a bit and look at the way that Iraq was run and Syria was run and some of those countries, looking at it from over here, it looked absolutely terrible, very strict regimes and that sort of thing. But as soon as that was lifted, the amount of freedom there was actually undermined the whole country.
Yeah. Plus it left vast areas completely ungoverned.
Yes, and in some countries, you may have had predominantly Muslim, but different factors of different groups of Muslim, different variations, and they were at war with each other. Some of them, very difficult to manage with a sort of a friendly way of governing, rather than the way that Gaddafi and others ran. They obviously knew what their country needed, and it was a very strict regime, very strict rules, and
iron fists.
And people knew that if they deviated from that road, boom, they were punished.
Yeah.
So even though, as I said, it looked from outside as if it was a terrible way of running a country, they knew that their country needed. And the thing about one of the things about refugees at the moment is that clearly there are people who are taking advantage of the numbers of people who want to leave their country or are persuaded to leave their country and come over to get a better job. Often they haven't got families with them. Many of them now die on the Mediterranean because the a boat that normally takes about 8 or 9 people, for instance, they put 30 or 40 people in there and don't make it. And the rescue boats aren't always able to pick them all up. But if they do, they clearly have to take them to Italy, France, Spain, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a very cruel regime. But also, some of the people that are brought over are made to work illegally and undercover. So it may be in an orchard, it may be in a factory, a farm, or whatever. They live in cabins.
Yeah.
50 people in a cabin just lying down at night, but not earning much during the day, but working very hard during the day.
Yeah.
And just keeping a small amount of what they should have earned. And the bigger amount goes to the people that organised it all.
Yeah.
So it's opened up other doors of inhuman activities, which is very, very
worrying.
It's not a healthy outcome really with the whole situation.
No, and also because like you said, the people who organise this sort of thing, a lot of them. People smugglers, whatever you want to call them, they're obviously involved in a lot of sort of nefarious work, and they're the ones they're gaining a lot out of this. So of course they're going to try and push those numbers up. They don't care whether 30, 40 people in a boat and whether that boat sinks and that kind of thing, because they get paid up front. And of course if they do make it to Europe or other places, then they again stand to gain from, like you said, this sort of inhumane commission that they're essentially getting off of labour.
Yes.
And on the one hand, this is a very sensitive topic, and I think that's one of the barriers actually in place to having a proper discussion about how to resolve this issue, is because as soon as you try and talk about this issue, you get a whole group, politicising this issue.
Yes.
I think there is obviously room for nuance in that. If there is room for empathy, of course, you have to look at the situation as a whole and understand that actually there are a lot of people here that are being victimised.
Oh, yes.
But at the same time, you have to be realistic. And what we're talking about is, like I said, we're looking at unprecedented numbers.
Oh, yes.
And of course, the biggest this you could argue throws a spanner in the works of integration. The old way, like you said before, we had these sort of unprecedented numbers. The way was, you sort of bring people in, they spend enough time in the community, they get integrated and that kind of thing, and that's effective. But when you bring people in en masse in such large numbers, like you're seeing, for instance, and a lot of this is down to the politicians of these countries as well, because a lot of these people are rehomed in very small rural areas where they actually become the majority in terms of the demographics. So there is this there's this really big concern for integration and what that means anymore. Other people see it as kind of entryism. Now, of course, I think there's an argument for both. But yeah. Now, another thing people have been saying as well is that there should be a certain priority system in terms of bringing people over. Say, for instance, and this is where it gets very tricky. For instance, there have been calls by some to say, okay, so we're willing to let people in, especially if they're coming from places that are at the moment deeply embedded in conflict, where they are literally fearing for their lives, their children's lives. Some people have been saying, okay, but maybe we should prioritise people that are at risk in their own countries, more at risk, say Coptic Christians or Jewish people, something like that, who are not just at risk of the conflicts going on, but are maybe the target of some of them. And again, it gets very tricky there, because what you're essentially suggesting is some kind of religious test, or some kind of test to sort of bring people. I mean, how would you feel about such an idea?
Well, yes. I mean, the numbers of people that come away from where they lived lost their homes because it was an area of conflict, and one of the ways in which that conflict was tried to be managed by the forces against them was to drop bombs on them.
Yeah.
But of course, that included bombing their houses, their churches, their mosques. They can't be very accurate in where they drop a bomb. And then there was the people on the ground. Various groups specialised in, as we know, bombing, from cars and that sort of thing, various parts of and that would often be where people lived. So that was a very legitimate reason why people left that area, and they couldn't go to the adjoining area because it was, the other faith that ruined that.
Well, of course,
because
even within the Islam, there is obviously at the moment the ongoing conflict between Sunni and Shia
in Iran as well.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So,
but Iran, going back to the point that we were making earlier, is very, very strict about how they manage their country.
Yeah.
And the two main Islamic faiths there may not like each other, may not be very friendly with each other and all the rest of it, but they have to live in a country where the rules are very, very clear and very strict.
Well, that's the thing. So essentially it's one law for all, regardless of your, and maybe, what we were talking about earlier, because, we're saying a lot of these countries are ruled with an iron fist, and it seems to actually be quite effective, because, again, when we're looking at the East, we're looking at it from a Western point of view. We wouldn't need this kind of thing in the West, but then we talk about the East, and we talk about, like Iraq, for instance, when you have, and let's talk real, large areas of desert that are completely unpoliceable, that are completely, so maybe it does help to have a very strong ideology and a very strong semblance of law and order and what is acceptable and what is not. It's just, how it comes about, what rights are being infringed upon, and this kind of thing. So it's but
and today you need to anticipate that China will do something with Hong Kong.
Oh yeah.
That would be unacceptable to many people watching from the outside and from the inside, obviously.
Yeah.
But China, I suspect, is taking the view that it has to stop, and if they're not going to stop voluntarily, then there's only one other way in which they will be forced to change the way that they behave.
The thing about the Hong Kong situation is it's very complicated, because it's essentially you have the Hong Kongians, and you had the whole. This was a deal that we had no say in. Of course, Tony Blair famously did the whole signing over ceremony, because it was a 99-year period in which Hong Kong would eventually go back to China's control, and the then Prime Minister. This was legislated well in the past. But the then Prime Minister at that time would have to essentially hand over Hong Kong jurisdiction over to the Chinese, and of course that was Tony Blair, and that kind of thing. Ironically, probably one of the less controversial things that he did, but no, I mean it is frustrating watching it though. Watching the scenes unfolding in Hong Kong at the moment.
Yes.
Because what you're seeing is a very small population
whose
values are more aligned with our own.
Yes.
This is essentially Britain in China. And you're seeing a very small community facing off against, 3 billion in mainland China?
Yes.
And this is a very scary, because going in and putting up you see sort of protest footage of them tearing down these facial recognition cameras, organising among themselves, and of course it's escalating now, and we're in this sort of position where we're on the outside looking in as this kind of dissent. The only thing we could legitimately do is take sanctions against China, but of course that has all kinds of repercussions.
But we're looking in from what was to what was a British colony.
Yeah.
And that's very different. I mean, that didn't make sense.
Very different to watching this happen in another Eastern country with another kind of thing. But because this is so, this is a British, essentially a British colony that's, say, under attack by China, because Hong Kong have made it very clear that they don't want to be ruled by China.
Absolutely.
And actually, one of the scary things at the moment, actually, because you see this sort of protesters have now been one protester was shot in the chest. Thankfully survived, but another woman, I believe, was shot with a rubber bullet, lost an eye. And what's scary about that is and correct me if I'm wrong, please fact check, but that's the Hong Kong authorities doing that. So we haven't even really got to the China stage yet. It's we're not really seeing, Chinese troops coming in and that kind of thing. At the moment, it's still Hong Kong. It's escalated. To this
I suspect
point.
it won't be too long before China is seen physically to move in, because they will not like the publicity that's around the world. That China can't cope with part of its
we can't handle
territory.
Yeah, they're somehow. It's not going to look good for their whole Belt and Road policy, because China they have something like a 300-year plan at the moment, and they are very much seen as these, and rightfully so, as this major emerging force in the world. We used to say as well that as it became more economically sound and that kind of thing, we assumed when it became more global and it became more strong and wealthy, we assumed at that point, okay, maybe they're going to leave behind some of these, it's like human rights violations. Maybe they'll become more of a democracy. That seems to be a theory that has been proven wrong.
Yes.
We assumed as they became more of a developed nation that they would become more democratic.
Yes.
And if anything, the opposite's true. It's still a one party system. The president is now president for life. which again, that's quite concerning as well. He's very much he's sort of like the new Mao, and the reason why China introduced strict term limits in the first place was to avoid someone else becoming like Mao.
Yes.
But we've seen that overturned. You know, again now no term limits.
Yeah.
And it's, I think our attention's more focused on it again because of Hong Kong.
Yes, and I think there's another issue, perhaps from some of the British leaders, is will we reach a stage where Gibraltar will be in a similar position in terms of the attitude to Spain and so on.
Let's not forget that Gibraltar was allowed to vote in the EU referendum in 2016. It seems like a lifetime ago now, but Gibraltar was allowed to vote, and they voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. I think something like 96%, and again, please fact check that. But yeah, it's overwhelming. So there is this sort of notion as well of, you know, maybe Gibraltar's more of a European kind of. Britain, we're kind of part-time Europeans, you know, or at least that's how we're perceived. Gibraltar, I think, considers itself more European, more probably part of Spain.
Yes.
And I think you're right. I think that's going to come back to haunt us at some point. I think we're very much going to see British colonies, all of it. Just
and the Falkland Islands as well as another example. Where,
but then again, let's get closer at home. Scotland. There's a real risk now, and this is with growing calls for a second referendum on the EU membership. I think if we go to second referendum, which I really hope we don't, if this happens, that will give Scotland the green light to do a second independence referendum.
That's correct, yes.
And I think we, this time, stand a real chance of them leaving the Union. And that's scary, how this is, you know, something like Brexit could ironically end up dividing more of Britain, like Gibraltar, like Scotland,
yes.
Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Going back to the EU, because you know you did spend some time working with Brussels and that kind of thing, and we can go back to the migrant topic. Chancellor Merkel, very criticised for her open door policy, and they've obviously taken a hit in the polls now because of this. Despite being a very, you know, it's always been a very coalition system over in Germany. That's the sort of point over there. They have proportional representation, I believe, solely because they're supposed to work with, you know, coalitions, that kind of thing. But you see parties like I suppose you can call them populist, Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative für Germany, who have now become the third largest party in the Bundestag. And again, this is a party, a lot of their policies are heavy criticisms of Merkel's migration policy. You know, we've seen a lot of drawbacks of this policy because essentially, I think it was something like 1 million people a day were coming through Germany at one point. And from that, you know, obviously these people aren't a monolith, they're not all the same, but obviously with that, if you're bringing in that many numbers, you're going to get a decent share, I think, of good and bad, and of intentions as well. People who are legitimately going to Europe because they're fleeing conflict or stuff like that. And then, like we said, the economic migrants that we talked about earlier. You know, what's your opinion on that kind of that? What we've seen is an open, like you say, open door policy.
Yes, and it was very evident, and I saw examples of it that say people from Poland coming across to work on farms and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Worked much harder than well, I mean, a lot of British people wouldn't apply for jobs there because it was a long day. It was subject to the weather, you know, being very difficult at times. But the Polish workers and Romanians and, you know, other groups that were coming here legitimately to work were taken advantage of as well,
Yeah.
and that's what happened in their own country as well. But they would earn a little bit more
Yeah.
over here.
The same applies to Britain, I think. We've, given, despite its benefits, free movement as well, I think, has, there are some sectors now where because of free movement, they take advantage of this. And some employers have deliberately denigrated their working standards, deliberately to attract, like you said, workers from Poland, Eastern Europe, sort of places to come
But
in.
also outside the EU as well.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just walk into the hospital today, and count how many Filipino nurses and doctors there are from outside the EU, but this country needs people like that.
Of course.
And
but in the legal way of,
Yeah.
they've gone through the correct channels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on some of my trips to the Philippines a couple of years ago, I was asked to try and recruit nurses
Right.
for people there, and so a number of them, applied through the processes, which could have been quite expensive at the time.
Yeah.
But the irony there is that they do actually train more nurses than they need in their hospitals.
Yeah.
And healthcare has to be paid for in the Philippines. It's not a free service, but they know that if their nurses and other carers go abroad, they earn money and send it back to relatives and friends in the Philippines to pay for their healthcare.
Right. If we go back to health, because I want to bring you onto that topic anyway, because you've spent a lot of time working, with hospitals in Colchester and Essex. I'm not entirely sure if you could just explain that a bit yourself.
Yes, well, about 20 years ago, I suppose it is now.
Yeah.
I was based in northeast Essex, and I chaired the joint planning of the health and social care organisations in northeast Essex, and that was very, very, not exciting, but certainly we were allowed to open up some situations that had not been considered before. An example of that was that there was as you have now, situations where people can't transfer from their emergency ward into a ward elsewhere in the hospital because there are too many people there that haven't been able to go home, or into residential care or whatever. So, and the term that they used then was bed blocking, and that actually prevented people coming into hospital or transferring within the hospital to a recovery ward or whatever. And bed blocking I saw as not a very nice description. So what we did was I suggested that, and the head of, talked to the head of the hospital at that time, and also the head of the health committee on the ground there, and what we did was I appointed one of my staff who was very, very strong, and she headed up the home help department within Northeast Essex, and was no stranger to difficult situations, and she dealt with those very effectively. So I asked the hospital to match up from one of their staff to this one, and then they would call that the hospital discharge team. There was only two of them. And what they did was, regardless of what other people had said in terms of that they have to stay in hospital for a bit and that sort of thing, they went in as a couple and decided who should go home and what they needed to get home. So they needed home care and that sort of thing. That was provided very quickly for them to get out. And it's interesting because on one of my visits to the hospital when I was a governor a few years ago, I went to visit the hospital discharge team, which was in quite a big office, and there was staff there from social care, healthcare, and because they weren't wearing uniforms, you couldn't tell the difference when you were listening to them, talking to them, which was social services and which was healthcare, because they acted together as a team for the benefit of the people and the hospital. So it was interesting. Once we did that, the numbers just escalated in terms of people leaving the hospital and creating bed spaces.
Right.
So much so that I attended a meeting of all the hospital chief executives from Essex in one of their regular meetings, and they wanted the same team in their hospitals because they saw it worked. It wasn't just in Essex. We were getting the Department of Health saw it and were quite pleased with the results, and they published that, and so we had phone calls from different parts of the country, to come and look at that, and that's why that developed like that. So that was very interesting.
It sounds like bureaucracy is quite an obstacle in there.
It was, yes,
Yeah.
and just a good example of that was sometimes when people were being assessed in hospital, whether they were able to leave, were asked to bend down, to reach up, to carry this and carry that, and a lot of them failed in those sort of tasks. So what we did was we took them home for the assessment. So once they were in their own kitchen, they were collecting things off top shelves and bending down and this sort of thing, no problem, compared to the assessment they had in the hospital.
So yeah, this is something I want to sort of end with because time's sort of against us now. But so with regards to let's not beat around the bush. The NHS in general is in a kind of they call it crisis, the NHS crisis. We've seen a sort of a decline, especially in the last few years. Yes, there's been very heavy cuts to do with austerity and that kind of thing. But what you're talking about is this kind of it would seem that some of the systems are not fit for purpose. Do you think this is one of the major obstacles of the NHS, and in terms of allocating resources and effectively and this kind of thing? Is it red tape and bureaucrats who are effectively the main issue, or is it something else?
Well, it's interesting, especially if you look at the situation with Colchester Hospital.
Yeah.
The combination of Ipswich Hospital and Colchester Hospital effectively is seen as one hospital on two sites. And there's some community hospitals as well, Harwich and Clacton and this way. That's very interesting because what they've been able to do, so for instance, people in northeast Essex that had severe heart issues, needed operations, that sort of thing, would often be taken to Basildon Hospital because that was the best hospital for that, or for some other stuff to one of the London hospitals like Great Ormond Street for children and that sort of thing, or to Addenbrooke's Hospital across in Cambridge for other things. So what they're able to do now is have specialist units in one of the hospitals, so they're not duplicating and running out of staff because they're trying to do two things for the same specialism. But for people who need those services, often travelling is an issue for them.
Yeah.
As it is now between, if you're coming to Colchester Hospital from Harwich, Clacton, Jaywick, whatever, that's quite a journey for some people. But there's a free service, transport service, etc. And the same for Ipswich Hospital and Colchester Hospital, people moving out of those areas. So it'll be interesting to see whether that works effectively as they have planned for. It does mean there's also a saving in services costs because you're having one specialist unit for a particular medical condition and not having to duplicate that. So, there are some issues as well about deficits and this sort of thing, which certainly in Colchester is being, I'm not sure that was the purpose of it, but the current parking situation in Colchester Hospital is absolutely mind-boggling in terms of the amount of spaces. If you look at the number of spaces that have been added over the last few years, it's quite considerable. But that reflects the number of people who need to go into the hospital and this sort of thing.
Cool. So we have, all these factors. Population rising, that's obviously a big factor as well. It's throwing more money at the issue every year. It still seems to be underfunded.
And a drop-off in the number of GPs, for instance.
Exactly. Like you said earlier as well, we also, not rely entirely, but there's a great deal of work that's done by foreign nationals in our NHS. But what I want to sort of put to you is, the purpose of the NHS. Now, the NHS is not a charity, and we all know this. This is it's something that's there for free. It's a social safety net. But the idea is that you pay into the system, and that when you are at your, and you can't. And the whole reason it was invented is just so, if you're due to unforeseen circumstances suddenly put out of work and that kind of thing, that you don't have to shoulder that burden alone, essentially. There's a social safety net that you've been paying into along with lots of other people. And I think personally that is something good about us. It's something that I would champion, because it says a lot about a society if you're willing to do that. But again, I want to come back to that point that it is not a charity. It's something that you pay into, and that you work towards, so it's there if you need it. Now, my point is, should the NHS, what we should be promoting, not just the NHS, but society in general, what we should be promoting, maybe, is healthier lifestyles. For instance, I've got some statistics here, and it said that the overall cost of obesity to one society is estimated at £27 billion. The UK-wide NHS cost attributable to overweight and obesity projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050.
That's a good example, because there was a report out last week on the number of children leaving primary school who were regarded as obese. Now, it's very unlikely under present circumstances that those children will, when they get to secondary school, drop their weight, that sort of thing. It won't. The situation is continuing and expanding throughout their childhood.
Yeah, we see similar figures for alcohol alcohol related things are estimated to cost the NHS around £3.5 billion per year, which amounts to something like £120 for every taxpayer. Overall, treating alcohol related conditions cost the NHS about 3.6% of its annual budget. See, healthcare costs of smoking. It's a bit trickier to pin down, but the estimates range from anywhere from £2 to £6 billion per year. And the costs sort of go up.
And diabetes is another example.
Diabetes, of course,
expanding.
But how do we, promote this? Now, I'm not saying this is what I want to go with, but let's look at one sort of option. Depending on the lifestyle you live, will affect the amount that you put into the NHS. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Should we be taxing people more, let's say, for NHS services? So let's say you are one of these people that is costing, let's say alcohol, something like that. Should the onus be on them to pay more into the system because they're taking more out of it? Or is the onus on society, or whoever, the government, NHS, health bodies, is the onus on them to be preventing this sort of thing? Preventing, smoking and alcohol. You're obviously going to have them, but to bring that number down, who is the onus on? Is it on the individual, or is it on...
Well, there's two major issues there. If you take alcohol and tobacco as examples, the amount of tax increasing on those two major consuming things are going up all the time, and that a lot of that money comes into the NHS.
Yeah.
But I think the things that are happening now is that there's much more emphasis in primary schools to teach children about health issues, but also more importantly, I think, get to their parents as well.
Yeah.
Because often if you look at the children who are obese and look at the lifestyle they have at home, maybe their parents are also having problems with their healthcare, including obesity, but also the amount of say takeaway foods and this sort of thing that families do compared to years and years ago. You know, the cooking that would go on in people's homes were often much more healthy, and people who were a bit overweight in those days really stood out because they were exceptional.
Yeah.
Whereas nowadays, if you watch, you know, children coming out of school, or as I did in schools when I was a governor at two of the schools, you could see the amount of children who were having major health issues increasing all the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes when parents were talked to about that individually rather than as a group, they saw that as interfering with the way that they lived.
Well, again, yeah, so I've seen similar criticisms of the recently introduced sugar tax.
Yes.
So, for all those unaware, although it should be obvious by now if you've tried to buy a can of Coke or something, that drinks with sugar are now taxed higher than ones without. So let's say you have two cans, a 330 milliliter can, one of Coca-Cola regular, and one of, let's say, Diet Cola or Coke Zero or something like that.
Yeah.
The can with the sugar will actually, what they're doing now is the can is less. It's something like 250 ml now, both for the same price, but there's less in the sugary one.
Yes.
And that's instead of having, let's say, two cans of 330 ml and one's just 20p more expensive than the other one. But again, it's the same sort of criticism because it's sort of saying, there are plenty of people who don't abuse this sort of thing. Plenty of people who have moderation. Let's say they have one can of Coke every month or something like that. Who, to all intents and purposes, live very healthy lifestyles otherwise, occasionally want a can of Coke, but are for some reason penalised because of the actions of others who are not moderating, who are, doing it to excess. And so we do sort of, we have that question of kind of who's the onus on? Who do we penalise in these kind of situations? Is it the individual or is it society at large?
Yes.
But, that's...
it's difficult.
It is difficult. Someone can't really answer.
In theory,
one
being able to talk to parents, both individually and as groups, and also children, appears, on paper to be a sensible thing to do. But we know from practice that sometimes parents are totally against being interfered with and don't see the dangers for their children.
Yeah, and personally, as a liberal, someone who takes personal liberty very seriously, it produces a kind of conundrum for myself as well, because it's sort of, in my mind, it's like, look, we live in a country, it's like, look, if you want to go and eat to excess and make yourself obese or cut your lifespan by drinking and smoking, ultimately you can. That is your right, and it's not for me to infringe upon. It's only for society to infringe upon when you start harming others, so children or just other people in society in general. So it is a very difficult kind of thing because it's effectively what we're doing is it's penalising everyone at once just for the sake of the people that do it to excess, and it poses a real conundrum to our system, really, because on the one hand, I've just said I'm a big believer in personal freedom, but at the same time, very wary of the fact that I could be paying more tax or something like that because the NHS is struggling, possibly partly in due to some of these unhealthy lifestyles, people drinking, people smoking, that kind of thing. But, again, though, it's a very layered discussion because a lot of these lifestyles are due to societal factors, especially things around addiction and anything could be an addiction. Overeating, obesity. Some of that is an addiction, and some of that is due to societal things.
Yes.
So yeah. But yeah, thank you very much for joining me today, and we hope to see some more of you in the future. Thanks everyone for listening. That concludes the show today. Join me back here next week. I'm not sure who I'm speaking to yet, but I'm sure it'll be a great guest.